Introduction: The Architecture of Fear. Stop letting your amygdala sabotage your future. Every second you hesitate, your deepest fears are quietly strangling your creative potential and architecting a life of mediocrity. You must reclaim your repressed energy right now, or risk being forever buried by your own shadows. This is not a metaphor. It is a thermodynamic reality. Your fear is not a feeling, it is an operating system. A primitive legacy code running in the dark basement of your neurology, executing commands that siphon your focus, hijack your decisions, and levy a silent tax on every ambition you dare to entertain. This system was installed for survival in a world of physical immediacy, yet it now governs a world of abstract consequence. The result is a profound architectural flaw in the foundation of your being. You are building a life atop faulty substrate, wondering why the structure groans and cracks under the weight of your own aspirations. This book is a demolition and reconstruction manual. We will not motivational speak. We will perform a forensic audit. We will trace the fear signal to its source, reverse engineer its circuitry, and repurpose its immense trapped voltage. The objective is not to feel brave. It is to become architecturally immune to sabotage, to forge a consciousness where fear is not the governor, but a managed resource. Your future is a design problem, and the first step is to understand the blueprint of your own collapse. Chapter 1: The Primordial Signal. Deconstructing Fear's Source Code. Consider the last time you felt a true, primal jolt of fear. Not anxiety, not worry, but a cold electric surge that locked your spine and dilated your pupils. Perhaps it was a near miss on the highway, the sound of breaking glass in the dead of night, or the moment before a high-stakes confrontation. In that instant, your entire world contracted to a single point of laser focus. All abstract thought, all future planning, all past regrets vanished. You were present, utterly and completely in a state of hyper-alert readiness. This is the primordial signal in its pure, undiluted form. It is not your enemy. It is a masterpiece of biological engineering, a legacy system written in the oldest, most efficient code your body possesses. The problem is not the signal itself. The problem is that in the modern world, this exquisitely tuned survival mechanism is being triggered by ghosts. By emails, by calendar notifications, by social slights, by the specter of financial instability or professional irrelevance. Your nervous system, designed to outrun predators and fight for territory, is now being hijacked by PowerPoint presentations and quarterly reviews. This is the central architectural flaw. You are running software from the Pleistocene epoch on hardware navigating the 21st century, and the system is throwing catastrophic errors. To deconstruct this, we must go deeper than psychology. We must enter the realm of neurology and evolutionary programming. The source of the fear signal is not a thought. It is a physical event, a cascade that begins in the subcortical basement of your brain, in a structure called the amygdala. Think of the amygdala not as a center for emotion, but as a hypersensitive threat detection grid. It operates below the level of conscious thought, scanning sensory input, a shape in the periphery, a tone of voice, a sudden shift in pressure, against a deep library of survival templates. When it registers a potential match, it does not send a memo to your prefrontal cortex for deliberation. It executes a command. It initiates a total system override. Neurotransmitters like glutamate fire, activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the launch sequence. Stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. Your heart rate spikes, pumping blood to major muscle groups. Your digestion halts. Your pupils widen to gather more light. Your entire physiology is mobilized for one of three actions: fight, flight, or freeze. This process happens in milliseconds, a full system reboot before your conscious mind has even loaded the login screen. Now, understand the critical failure point in the modern context. For our ancestors, this cascade resolved itself physically. The lion was fought or fled from, the adrenaline was burned, the cortisol metabolized through action, the circuit completed, and the system returned to baseline. Your crisis does not resolve with physical motion. You cannot punch your quarterly deficit in the face. You cannot outrun a failing merger. So the cascade does not complete. The stress hormones continue to circulate. The elevated heart rate persists. The muscles, primed for explosive action, remain tense. This unresolved physiological state is what you experience as chronic anxiety, as dread, as that background hum of unease that follows you from the boardroom to your bedroom. It is a stuck process, a feedback loop with no exit command. Your body is perpetually mobilized for a battle that never physically manifests, draining your energy reserves and corroding your systems from within. This is the silent tax. You are paying it in mental fog, in compromised immune function, in degraded sleep, in the inability to access deep, creative flow states. Let us dismantle the most common excuse here, the belief that this is simply your personality, that you are a worrier. This is a profound failure of self-diagnosis. You are not your amygdala's output. You are the system administrator who has been locked out of the control room. The fear response is automatic, but your relationship to it is not. The space between the trigger and your reaction, that nanosecond of potential awareness, is the frontier of your sovereignty. Most men never perceive this space. They are the cascade. The email from the boss arrives, and in an instant, they are catapulted into a narrative of failure, termination, ruin. The cascade has already hijacked the narrative engine. Your task is not to stop the initial signal. That is impossible and undesirable, as it is a vital, life-preserving function. Your task is to intercept the secondary elaboration, the story your mind instantly constructs atop the raw physiological data. To master this, you must become a forensic observer of your own inner mechanics. The next time you feel that familiar tightening in your chest, that rush of heat, do not reach for the distraction. Do not scroll. Do not rationalize. Do not bury it in work. Freeze the frame. Conduct a systems check. Locate the sensation physically. Is it a knot in the stomach, a constriction in the throat, a tremor in the hands? Observe it with the detached curiosity of an engineer examining a gauge reading. This act of observation introduces a critical delay in the processing loop. It inserts a wedge of conscious awareness into the automated chain. You are no longer the passenger in a vehicle hurtling toward a cliff. You have momentarily grasped the wheel. In this space you can begin to ask the foundational questions. What is the immediate physical threat? Is there a lion in the room? Is my life in imminent danger? 99.9% of the time the answer is a cold, hard no. You are safe. The threat is conceptual, a ghost of a possible future, not a present reality. This is where we repurpose the voltage, the immense energy mobilized by the fear response, the sharpened focus, the heightened awareness, the surge of potential force, is not evil. It is neutral power. It is your biological capital being activated. The primitive goal of this energy was to propel your fist or fuel your sprint. The evolved goal is to propel your focus into a complex problem, to fuel your concentration in a high-stakes negotiation, to sharpen your strategic thinking when under pressure. The physiological state of fight or flight and the state of peak performance are neurologically adjacent. They share the same hormonal substrate. The difference is one of direction and narrative. Fear says, "This energy is for survival against a threat." Mastery says, "This energy is for conquest of a challenge." The raw material is identical. You are not trying to calm down, you are learning to redirect. The trembling hands before a public speech are not a sign of weakness. They are an abundance of kinetic energy waiting for a channel. Your job is to build that channel, to transform the tremor into precise gesture, the rapid heartbeat into passionate delivery, the narrowed focus into unwavering connection with your message. This requires a recalibration of your entire relationship with discomfort. The modern man has been conditioned to seek the elimination of all friction, the smoothing of all edges. This is a path to architectural weakness. Your nervous system, like a muscle or the immune system, requires exposure to manageable stresses to grow robust. The goal is not a life devoid of the fear signal, but a system so resilient, so well-tuned, that the signal becomes information, not a system crash. It becomes the rumble strip on the highway, alerting you to drift, not the sound of the crash itself. You must begin to court controlled doses of the very sensations you avoid. The cold plunge that shocks the system, the deliberate initiation of a difficult conversation, the commitment to a task just beyond your proven competence. In these acts, you are not suffering. You are conducting stress tests. You are gathering data on your own thresholds. You are teaching your amygdala, through repeated exposure, that this elevated state can be associated with growth, with triumph, with expansion, not just with mortal peril. You are rewriting the legacy code line by line through conscious, repeated action. Do not mistake this for naive, positive thinking. This is rigorous cognitive engineering. Every time you intercept the cascade and choose a different response, you are physically altering the neural pathways in your brain. You are weakening the old automatic connections between perceived threat and full system panic, and strengthening new pathways between heightened arousal and focused application. This is neuroplasticity in action, the literal remodeling of your brain's architecture through deliberate practice. You are the architect, and the material is your own synaptic wiring. The fear is the blueprint of the old, crumbling structure. Your conscious action is the demolition charge and the new I-beam. This is the deconstruction. This is the beginning of understanding that the very mechanism you believed was sabotaging you is, in fact, a dormant reactor of immense power. Your first task is not to fight it, but to study its schematics until you know every circuit, every failsafe, every power conduit. Only then can you begin the work of bringing it under your command. Chapter 2. The Feedback Loop. Intercepting the Neurological Cascade. Command of the reactor begins not with grand gestures, but with the silent millisecond by millisecond interception of a cascade. You have studied the schematics. You know the ancient alarm system, the amygdala, is a hypersensitive sentry wired to err on the side of catastrophe. Its activation is not a verdict, but an initial crude broadcast. The true system failure, the one that transmutes a fleeting jolt into chronic dread, occurs in the next phase, the feedback loop. This is where the signal, left unchallenged, amplifies itself into a deafening roar that hijacks your entire cognitive mainframe. Your work now is to become the master systems operator who inserts a filter into this loop, breaking the cycle before it achieves operational lock. Understand the mechanics of this hijacking with the cold precision of a network engineer diagnosing a denial-of-service attack. The primordial signal, the amygdala's distress flare, triggers the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, your body's central command for mobilization. This is the protocol execution. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream, your heart rate spikes, blood is shunted to major muscle groups, and your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational judgment, strategic planning, and executive function, is deliberately deprioritized. Biologically, this makes perfect sense. If a predator is charging, you do not need to philosophize, you need to run or fight. The system is designed for a short, violent burst of action that resolves the threat and allows the hormones to dissipate. But your modern world deals in psychological predators, a looming deadline, a volatile market, a critical conversation. These threats do not charge, they linger. And because you take no physical action, no flight, no fight, the mobilized energy has nowhere to go. The cortisol does not metabolize through exertion. It continues to circulate. The elevated heart rate is not followed by a period of recovery. It becomes a persistent background hum. This unresolved physiological state creates the first layer of the feedback loop. Your body, still waiting for the physical resolution that never comes, reports back to the brain. Threat ongoing, maintain alert status. The amygdala, receiving this confirmation from your own physiology, fires again. It interprets the sustained cortisol level as proof that the danger is real and present. And so, it reactivates the HPA axis. More cortisol, more adrenaline, a heightened state of vigilance. This is the neurological echo chamber. The initial spark generates a physiological response, which the brain misreads as new evidence, generating a stronger spark, which produces a more intense response. It is a closed circuit of reinforcement, a recursive algorithm of anxiety. Your own body becomes the primary source of corroborating data for your terrified mind. You feel your heart hammering and think, I must be in real danger, which makes your heart hammer harder. The loop is now self-sustaining. The prefrontal cortex, your command center, remains offline, suppressed by the very chemistry designed to save you. You are left with the raw, unmodulated output of the survival brain, narrating a catastrophe from the somatic data of a mobilized system. This is how a thought becomes a feeling, becomes a bodily state, becomes a more intense thought. This is the architecture of a panic attack, and in a milder form, the engine of chronic low-grade anxiety. Your point of intervention is not the initial spark. That is a legacy function, a hardware trigger too fast to consciously stop. Your leverage is in the space immediately after the spark, before the feedback loop achieves critical mass and goes autonomous. This space is the synaptic gap, the micro-territory between the neural firing and the full hormonal cascade. It is here you must install your intercept protocol. The tool for this is not brute force suppression, which only adds energy to the loop. The tool is meta-awareness, the conscious, deliberate observation of the cascade as it initiates. When the internal alarm sounds, your first operational command is a non-action. You do not engage with the content of the fear. You do not argue with the narrative of impending doom. Instead, you shift your focus from the what to the how. You become a diagnostician of your own inner state. Feel the adrenaline hit as a somatic event, the tightening in the chest, the clenching in the gut, the rush of heat. Identify it. Label it internally with technical detachment. Observe amygdala activation, HPA axis engaging, cortisol release detected. This act of conscious observation is neurologically revolutionary. It forces a trickle of energy back to the prefrontal cortex. It is the equivalent of rerouting a small amount of power from the screaming alarm system back to the silent control room. By naming the process, you create a critical separation. You are no longer being the fear. You are witnessing the fear system operate. This separation is the filter you insert into the feedback loop. It breaks the direct, unmediated link between physiological sensation and catastrophic narrative. The sensation may continue, but it is now tagged as a system process, not as an objective truth about your environment. The heart palpitation is no longer proof I am failing. It is elevated cardiovascular output due to norepinephrine. The tightness in the throat is not suffocation. It is the constriction of superficial blood vessels, a peripheral effect of the fight-or-flight response. You are translating the language of panic back into the cold specifications of your biological hardware. This intercept protocol must be drilled until it is faster than the loop itself. It is a martial art for the mind. Through repetition, you compress the time between trigger and observation from seconds to milliseconds. You are training a new, competing neural pathway. The old pathway is threat signal, amygdala, HPA cascade, catastrophic narrative, reinforced fear. The new pathway you are forging is threat signal, amygdala, meta-awareness, intercept, physiological sensation, observed as data, prefrontal cortex, re-engagement, strategic assessment. You are not stopping the initial signal. You are installing a bypass that prevents it from escalating into a full system takeover. The energy you reclaim through this interception is immense. The cortisol and adrenaline in your bloodstream are not toxins, they are potent performance fuels. They increase glucose availability, sharpen sensory perception, and prepare the body for intense effort. The feedback loop misdirects this energy into a chaotic internal storm, leaving you paralyzed and exhausted. The intercept protocol captures this energy at the source and holds it for your conscious direction. The tightness in your chest is not anxiety, it is potential energy for focused action. The restlessness in your limbs is not panic, it is kinetic energy waiting for a channel. Therefore, the final critical step of breaking the feedback loop is directed expenditure. The intercepted energy must be given a physical or cognitive outlet that the system recognizes as a resolution. This is the modern equivalent of the fight-or-flight response. It can be a single, decisive action, drafting the first paragraph of the report you're avoiding, making the difficult phone call, executing 5 minutes of intense calisthenics. The action need not solve the entire problem. Its purpose is to provide the feedback loop with the closure it biologically craves. It signals to the ancient brain, action has been taken. The threat is being engaged. This begins the process of down-regulating the HPA axis. Cortisol levels begin to fall. The physiological confirmation of threat ceases, and the amygdala stands down. Mastery of this chapter is the mastery of a closed system. You are learning to operate the pressure valves and circuit breakers of your own neurology. The feedback loop, once a prison of self-generating dread, becomes a controlled reaction chamber. The fear signal enters, is observed, its energy is quantified and captured, and is then discharged through a conduit of your choosing. You are no longer a passive reactor to your environment. You are the engineer who manages the reaction. The cascade does not control you. You harness the cascade. The loop does not define your reality. You define the loop's output. This is the silent internal work of sovereignty, the minute-to-minute governance of the very forces that once governed you. The reactor is now on standby, its immense power available, awaiting your command for what to build next. Chapter 3. Shadow Capital. Auditing your psychological liabilities. That command, however, is not the final step. It is the beginning of a new discipline. To hold that power on standby is to possess a volatile asset, an unrefined resource. A reactor's output is meaningless without a grid to channel it, without machinery to convert its raw potential into measurable work. You have intercepted the signal and broken the loop. You now possess a quantity of energy you once paid out as a psychological tax. This reclaimed capital is real. It is electrochemical, physiological, and like any capital, it demands an audit. You must now turn a forensic gaze inward, not upon the transient signal, but upon the permanent structures it once funded. You must conduct a full accounting of your psychological liabilities. Consider the architecture of a modern corporation. Its value is not determined by its cash on hand in a single moment, but by its balance sheet, a cold ledger of assets against liabilities. For decades, perhaps for your entire cognitive life, your fear response has been the primary creditor financing your liabilities. Every avoidance, every rationalization, every self-diminishing narrative, every instance of procrastination masquerading as preparation. These are not mere behaviors, they are psychological debts. Your amygdala, that ancient and relentless venture capitalist, has been issuing high-interest loans of adrenaline and cortisol to keep these operations solvent. The anxiety you felt was the compounding interest on that debt. Now, with the reactor under your command, that funding source is cut off. The shadow enterprise you've been running is about to face an audit in the cold light of conscious awareness. This audit is not about guilt. It is about topology. You are mapping the entrenched patterns that consume your energy. The first major liability is the catastrophic narrative fund. This is the internal department dedicated to scripting worst-case scenarios. It is not a passive daydream, it is an active, resource-intensive simulation. It draws upon memory, projects hypotheticals, and engages your emotional and physiological systems as if the simulation were real. Previously, the fear cascade funded this department lavishly, providing the emotional fuel for its vivid productions. Your new protocol of observation and redirection has frozen its accounts. Now you see the scripts for what they are: costly fiction. The energy that once animated elaborate tragedies is now sitting idle, awaiting reassignment. Parallel to this is the avoidance infrastructure. This is the physical and cognitive machinery built to evade perceived threats. It includes the circuitous routes you take in conversations to sidestep conflict, the over-preparation that serves as a barrier to decisive action, the deliberate obscurity you cultivate to avoid being measured. This infrastructure was expensive to build and maintain. It required constant vigilance, cognitive load, and the erosion of your integrity. Its sole purpose was risk mitigation, but its effect was opportunity cost. It turned your psyche into a fortified bunker, designed for survival, not expansion. With the fear signal disarmed, you walk this infrastructure like a ghost town. You see the empty guard posts, the unused barriers. You recognize the sheer tonnage of mental and emotional resources poured into building a prison you then inhabited. Beneath these operational liabilities lies the foundational one, the identity debt. This is the core narrative of "I am not the type of person who," or "I could never." It is a story you took out a loan to believe, and you have been paying interest on it ever since. The fear response acted as the enforcer for this debt, punishing any deviation from this limited identity with spikes of anxiety. To even consider acting against this story triggered the cascade, which you then interpreted as proof that the story was true. It was a perfect circular prison. By seizing control of the cascade, you have effectively declared bankruptcy on this identity debt. The enforcer is gone. The story remains, but it is now just text on a page, devoid of its electrochemical enforcement mechanism. You are left staring at the hollow core of a persona built on borrowed fear. The process of this audit is surgical and unsentimental. You do not judge the past architect of these liabilities. You merely assess their present structural integrity and cost of maintenance. You take a ledger and you itemize. For 30 minutes, you write. You do not write about your feelings. You catalog operations, liability, excessive scenario simulation regarding career pivot, energy drain, high, last incident, 72 hours ago, trigger, seeing a peer's success, redirected energy to drafting first step action plan. You are moving from the realm of emotion to the realm of engineering. Each identified liability is a circuit that once drew power from the fear reactor. You are now tracing those circuits to their source and disconnecting them. This is where the theoretical becomes tactical. The looming deadline, the volatile market, the critical conversation. These are not generic stressors. They are your specific psychological predators, and they are not random. They are attracted to the specific frequencies emitted by your psychological liabilities. The deadline predator feeds on the catastrophic narrative fund's production of "I will fail and be exposed." The market predator is drawn to the vibrations of your avoidance infrastructure, sensing a target that will retreat rather than adapt. The conversation predator hunts by the scent of identity debt, circling those who believe, "I am not persuasive." Your previous life was spent hiding from these predators in the shadow of your liabilities. Your new task is to use the predator as a diagnostic tool. The flare of intercepted fear when you think of the market is not a signal to hide. It is a spotlight, illuminating the exact location of an unexamined liability in your financial risk tolerance. The tension before the conversation is not a warning to be silent. It is a schematic, revealing the weak load-bearing points in your self-concept. Thus, the audit is complete, not when you have a list, but when you have a blueprint for demolition and reallocation. The energy you once hemorrhaged, the capital that flowed into scripting catastrophes, maintaining avoidances, and servicing a false identity, is now quantifiable. It is a pool of potential. This is your shadow capital. It is the power that was always present but was trapped, financing the very structures that imprisoned it. You have not created new energy. You have liberated captured energy. You have performed a hostile takeover of your own psyche's most wasteful divisions. The emotional and cognitive resources you will now wield are immense, precisely because they were previously so misused. Their potency is proven by the sheer strength of the prison they once built. You are not starting from a deficit. You are standing in the control room of a reclaimed power plant, its generators still humming with the energy of your former fears, now awaiting a new purposeful load. The next protocol is not management. It is alchemy. You must build the crucible and the conduit to transmute this latent shadow capital into kinetic, creative force. The audit is over. The repurposing begins. Chapter 4. The Alchemical Crucible, Protocol for Energy Transmutation. This reclaimed power plant you now command does not run on goodwill or positive thinking. It operates on physics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Your shadow capital, that dense, volatile mass of energy once powering your dread, now sits in a state of potential, like supercooled plasma contained by magnetic fields. Left untended, It will seek its old circuits, its familiar paths of least resistance, re-energizing the very narratives you just audited. The audit was diagnostics. This is engineering. You must now construct the crucible and the precise protocol for energy transmutation. This is not a metaphor. It is the operational procedure for converting psychological potential into kinetic output. The crucible is not a place you go. It is a state you engineer within the architecture of your own awareness. It is the deliberate, conscious container you build in the space between stimulus and response, the very space you seized in the initial interception. Previously, that space was a vacuum, instantly filled by the automatic cascade. Now you must pressurize it with intention. Think of it as constructing a magnetic containment field in a fusion reactor. The plasma, your raw, chaotic fear energy, is immensely powerful but destructive if unleashed randomly. The containment field, your constructed crucible of conscious observation, holds it in place, allowing for controlled reactions. This field is built from three fused components: radical acceptance, non-identification, and intentional direction. Radical acceptance is the first and most critical alloy in your crucible's walls. It is the absolute, unsentimental acknowledgement of the energy's presence and properties. When the shadow capital surges, a familiar tightness in the chest, a wave of heat, the mental script of impending failure beginning its playback, your first protocol is not to deny it, suppress it, or argue with its content. That is fighting the plasma with a hammer. It only amplifies the disruption. Your move is to acknowledge its existence with the cold precision of a systems engineer noting a pressure spike. Acceptance detected, adrenaline signature confirmed, narrative initiation attempt logged. This act of labeling without judgment starves the emotional reaction of the oxygen of your resistance. It allows the energy to exist as a pure phenomenon, separate from the story it once told. You are not accepting the catastrophe as truth. You are accepting the voltage as data. Non-identification is the structural integrity of the containment field. This is where you sever the final wire connecting the energy surge to your sense of self. In the old architecture, the thought, "I am afraid," was a complete circuit, linking the physiological event directly to your core identity, triggering a cascade of secondary narratives about weakness and inadequacy. Your new protocol rewires this. The sensation is not "my fear." It is the fear signal. The catastrophic thought is not "my future." It is the catastrophic narrative subroutine. This is a linguistic and cognitive shift of monumental importance. You are not the storm. You are the atmospheric pressure system that contains it. You are not the reactor core. You are the control room monitoring its output. This dispassionate reframing transforms the experience from a personal flaw into an impersonal process you manage. The energy, now stripped of its identity hook, loses its existential weight and becomes mere raw material. With the energy accepted and disidentified, your crucible is sealed and pressurized. Now comes the alchemy, intentional direction. This is the moment you open the plasma conduit and aim the torrent. The energy coursing through your system is biochemically identical to the energy of focused ambition, of competitive drive, of creative flow. It is pure sympathetic nervous system activation. The only difference is its target. Your protocol here is surgical. You must have a predefined load ready to accept this energy transfer. This is not abstract. It is a physical or cognitive action of deliberate, often uncomfortable engagement. The deadline predator that once fed on your catastrophic narrative fund. Its energy is now redirected into the next immediate, tangible action step of the project itself. The physical agitation is not a signal to retreat. It is the biological fuel for focused work. You stand up, you channel the tremor in your hands into typing, you convert the rapid heartbeat into the rhythm of relentless progress. You give the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis the physical expenditure it was screaming for, but you dictate the terms and the target. This transmutation protocol follows a strict sequence, a repeatable algorithm for mastery. First, sensory interception. You feel the surge. Second, crucible formation. You apply acceptance and non-identification, containing the energy. Third, target acquisition. You consciously select the predetermined constructive action that will serve as the energy's new sink. Fourth, directed expenditure. You execute the action with the energy as your propellant. The action completes the circuit that was previously left open, providing the biological closure that down-regulates the stress response. The fear did not vanish. It was consumed as fuel. The shadow capital has been converted into kinetic output. You have taken the psychological liability, the energy that once built imaginary prisons, and you have used it to lay bricks in the physical world. Consider the executive facing a market downturn, the very scenario that once triggered the full avoidance infrastructure. The initial jolt hits, the pit in the stomach, the cold clarity of threat. The old circuit would have initiated evasion, obsessive news-checking, circular discussions, mental escape fantasies. Now the protocol engages. The sensation is accepted as a biochemical event. It is labeled threat response activation, not my impending ruin. The mobilized energy, the sharpened focus, the hypervigilance, all these are now recognized as tools, not torments. The intentional direction is immediately applied. This energy is poured into a cold, rational analysis of the new market constraints. It fuels the drafting of contingency plans A, B, and C. It drives the difficult conversation with the team, not from a place of panic, but from a place of mobilized, focused capacity. The predator has not been slain, it has been harnessed. Its teeth are now gears in your analytical engine. This is the alchemical crucible in operation. It turns the lead of dread into the gold of directed action. Each successful transmutation is more than a tactical win. It is a physical rewiring. You are teaching your nervous system a new, more efficient pathway. You are proving, through repeated experiment, that this intense energy has a higher purpose function. The synaptic connections that once linked threat signal to catastrophic narrative and paralysis begin to weaken from disuse. The new connections linking threat signal to conscious container to directed output are myelinated, becoming faster, more automatic. The crucible itself becomes a permanent installation in your psyche's infrastructure. You are no longer a subject to your fear. You are not even its master. You are its alchemist. You have built the apparatus to take what is base, chaotic and destructive, and, through a disciplined protocol of containment and redirection, transform it into something of immense value and power. The shadow capital is not just reclaimed, it is now your primary feedstock. Every surge of anxiety, every pulse of dread, every whisper of insecurity is no longer a warning siren. It is the indicator light on your control panel, signaling the arrival of raw power into the containment field. Your only question is no longer, how do I make this stop? It is, what will I build with this now? The crucible is sealed. The plasma is contained, the conduit is open. Begin the transmutation. Chapter 5. Operational Integration, Building the Daily Practice Engine. Now the crucible must become a factory. The alchemical moment, the brilliant, controlled flash of transmutation, is not a singular event to be celebrated and forgotten. It is the prototype, the proof of concept, the successful laboratory test that now demands industrial-scale replication. You have captured lightning in a bottle. The imperative is to build the power grid, to take that flawless, isolated protocol and hardwire it into the substructure of your daily existence until it ceases to be a procedure you perform and becomes the environment you inhabit. This is the phase beyond theory, beyond even successful experiment. This is operational integration, the engineering of a life where fear's energy is not an occasional fuel source, but the steady, reliable current powering a relentless engine of autonomous creation. Consider the architecture of any formidable system. A jet engine does not achieve thrust through a single heroic combustion. It operates through a continuous, precisely timed cycle: intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. Each phase feeds the next in a self-sustaining loop. Your psychological reactor must achieve the same. The four-phase protocol you've mastered, intercept, contain, target, expend, is your combustion cycle. But an engine left on the bench is merely a sculpture. It must be mounted, connected to a drive shaft, integrated with controls, fuel lines and cooling systems. Your daily life is that airframe. Your habits, your environment, your schedule, your rituals, these are the mounting brackets, the avionics, the hydraulic lines. Operational integration is the meticulous process of bolting your reactor into the fuselage of your reality and ensuring it fires in perfect sequence, on demand, under load. The first mounting bracket is temporal architecture. You must move from opportunistic alchemy to scheduled production. The mind, in its default state, is a reactive organ. It waits for stimuli, for the phone to ping, for the crisis to erupt, for the wave of anxiety to crash. This is a subsistence existence. You are a scavenger of moments, not a commander of time. Integration begins by inverting this relationship. You do not wait for fear to provide the fuel. You allocate the fuel to the tasks that matter. This means instituting a non-negotiable daily practice, a sacred defended block of time that serves as your primary combustion chamber. This is not a morning routine of passive consumption. It is a proactive launch sequence. Within this block, you run the protocol not on incoming dread, but on the latent ambient energy of resistance itself, the gravitational pull of the pillow, the seductive whisper of distraction, the low-grade fear of the blank page or the heavy lift. You begin by intercepting the signal of lethargy. You contain it with the acknowledgement, this resistance is energy. You target it toward the single most cognitively demanding creative or strategic task on your docket. You expend it through the first 20 minutes of unbroken, deep focus work. You are not writing a report. You are conducting a cold start of your reactor using the cheapest, most abundant fuel available, your own innate resistance to effort. By succeeding here, you accomplish two things. You complete vital work at the peak of your mental clarity, and you train the neural circuitry of the protocol on a daily, predictable cadence. You are building muscle memory for power generation under controlled conditions, so when a true storm of anxiety hits, your response is not a panicked novelty, but a well-drilled emergency procedure. The second integration point is environmental engineering. Your physical and digital spaces are not neutral. They are either conduits for your reactor's output or heat sinks that dissipate its energy into chaos. Audit your primary environments, your workspace, your digital dashboard, your home, with the cold eye of a systems analyst. Every object, every application, every open tab is a valve. Is it directing energy toward a defined target, or is it leaking it into the void? The clutter on your desk is not just mess. It is visual static, a constant low-level cognitive drain that forces your prefrontal cortex to waste cycles on filtering. The unchecked notification stream on your devices is not just interruption. It is a hijacking of your intercept mechanism designed to trigger microdoses of amygdala response, curiosity, fear of missing out, social anxiety, to steal your attention. To integrate your reactor, you must harden these environments. Create a primary work cell that is surgically clean, tool-oriented, and signal-proof. This is your cockpit. When you enter it and initiate your practice block, you are closing the canopy. The outside world's frequencies are muted. Here, the only signals are the ones you generate, and the only energy flow is the one you direct from Crucible to creation. This extends to your digital landscape. Aggressive filtration is not a productivity hack. It is reactor shielding. Use tools that batch inputs, block predatory interfaces, and allow information to flow only at your designated intake periods. Your environment must become a passive amplifier of your will, not an active saboteur of your focus. The third and most critical integration is the recalibration of your internal dashboard. In a primitive state, your conscious attention is fixated on external metrics and emotional weather reports, likes, bank balances, the mood of others, the specter of future lack. These are lagging indicators, the exhaust fumes of a process already completed. The integrated operator shifts his primary gauges to leading indicators, the internal metrics of the reactor itself. Your key performance indicators are no longer just outcomes, but the fidelity and efficiency of your energy transformation process. You must learn to monitor your own throughput. Gauge 1. Intercept latency. How many milliseconds elapse between the physiological surge of a stress response and your conscious recognition of it as pure energy? This is your reaction time. With practice, this latency approaches zero. You feel the heat in your chest and immediately think fuel, not fear. Gauge 2. Containment integrity. Does the energy spill into catastrophic narrative, or does it hold in the neutral space of the crucible? This is your pressure reading. Gauge 3. Targeting precision. Is the chosen action a high-value, meaningful creation, or a disguised avoidance tactic like reorganizing files? This is your guidance system. Gauge 4. Expenditure completeness. Does the action fully consume the charge, leaving a sense of clean exhaustion and built reality, or does a residual jittery energy remain? This is your combustion efficiency. By auditing these gauges daily, you move from being a passenger in your psychology to being the flight engineer. A rough idle, a pressure spike, an inefficient burn. These are not moral failures. They are system diagnostics. They tell you which component needs maintenance. Perhaps your intercept latency is high because you are sleep-deprived, degrading your meta-awareness. Maybe your containment is leaking because you haven't clearly defined your core non-identities. I am not my job title. I am not this temporary feeling. You adjust, you refine, you tighten the seals. This is the essence of operational integration, a life lived not as a series of emotional reactions, but as a continuous, self-optimizing feedback loop of energy conversion. The final stage is the automation of sovereignty. At the outset, each run of the protocol requires Herculean conscious effort. It is a manual override of a system screaming its ancient alarms. But through relentless daily integration, through temporal architecture, environmental hardening, and dashboard monitoring, a profound shift occurs. The manual override becomes the default program. The reactor, once bolted on, becomes the core power plant. The day comes when you face a legitimate seismic threat, a market collapse, a personal betrayal, a physical risk, and you note, with detached curiosity, the absence of panic. In its place is a deep, resonant hum. It is the sound of all systems operating at capacity. The intercept is instantaneous. The containment field is stable. The target, clear. The expenditure, total. You are not brave. You are efficient. The emotion others call courage is, in your engineered reality, simply the byproduct of a perfectly tuned system converting high-grade threat energy into flawless, decisive action. This is the birth of the practice engine. It does not sleep. It does not doubt. It does not seek motivation. It seeks only feedstock. And in a world of endless uncertainty, criticism, competition and challenge, feedstock is the one resource that will never be depleted. Every obstacle, every rejection, every moment of doubt ceases to be a threat to your peace. It is a delivery of raw material to your loading bay. Your integrated life becomes a continuous act of alchemy, not in sporadic flashes, but in a steady, unstoppable throughput. You have moved from building a crucible to operating a refinery. The product is no longer a moment of transformed fear, but a sustained reality of autonomous power. The factory is online. The cycle is perpetual. Begin production. Chapter 6. Sovereign Output. The Mechanics of Autonomous Creation. Now the refinery must produce. It is not enough to have a system that consumes fear and neutralizes threats. A reactor that only manages its own waste heat is a monument to survival, not sovereignty. The perpetual cycle you have engineered demands an output. It requires a product. This is the transition from internal alchemy to external architecture. You have mastered the protocol of energy transmutation. You have built the daily practice engine. The question now shifts from how do I handle this to what do I build with this? This is the mechanics of autonomous creation. This is the design of sovereign output. Consider the fundamental law of thermodynamics applied to the human psyche. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. For years, your psychological energy, your focus, your emotional intensity, your nervous vitality was transformed into the architecture of your own prison. It fueled catastrophic narratives. It financed avoidance infrastructure. It serviced a crushing identity debt. The audit revealed this. The alchemy intercepted it. The practice engine now captures this energy flow at its source, but capture is not the end state. Captured energy, if not directed, becomes potential energy, a stored charge that will seek its own path, often back into the old familiar circuits of anxiety. Your liberated shadow capital is not a trophy to be admired. It is fuel waiting for an engine. You must now design that engine. You must become a creator, not just a converter. Sovereign output begins with a ruthless redefinition of work. For the fear-based individual, work is obligation. It is a transaction performed to avoid consequence, the consequence of poverty, of judgment, of obscurity. The energy input is dread, and the output is mere compliance. The quality is that of a prisoner laboring in a chain gang. Every action is perfunctory, every project is a burden, every success is a temporary relief from a sentence. Your new engine operates on a different principle. Its fuel is not dread, but directed intensity. Its purpose is not compliance, but creation. The work is no longer an obligation to the external world. It is an expression of the internal order you have engineered. You are not building to please a master. You are building to manifest a blueprint that exists within the quiet core of your own operational center. This requires a shift from a consumer to a producer mindset at the deepest cognitive level. The consumer mind is passive, reactive, and extractive. It scans the environment for signals to absorb, opinions to adopt, shortcuts to take. It asks, "What does the world want from me?" The producer mind is active, generative, and contributive. It looks inward to its own store of reclaimed energy and asks, "What unique structure can I assemble from this material?" The consumer fears scarcity. The producer understands that his primary resource, his capacity for focused effort, is regenerated through use. The very act of creation replenishes the well. The practice engine you built ensures this cycle is closed and self-sustaining. Resistance, doubt, external friction, these are no longer threats to your peace. They are the impurities in the feedstock that, when processed through your crucible, yield the purest form of creative fuel. Let us architect the output mechanism. The first component is the blueprint chamber. This is not a vague vision board or a list of goals. It is a rigorous internal design studio. Here, you move beyond reacting to life's demands and begin imposing your own form upon the raw material of time and circumstance. The blueprint is a schematic of a desired reality, drafted with the cold precision of an engineer. It defines the load-bearing structures, the core project, the skill pillars required, the sequential phases of construction. It anticipates stress points and designs reinforcements. This blueprint is not a fantasy. It is a set of executable instructions for your reclaimed energy. It answers the critical question, toward what specific, tangible endpoint will I direct the next surge of intensity? The second component is the fabrication loop. This is where the alchemical protocol integrates directly with creative action. Recall the sequence: intercept, contain, target, expend. In the context of sovereign output, the target is no longer a generic constructive action. It is a precise, blueprint-aligned task. The moment you feel the familiar somatic signature of anxiety, the tightened chest, the racing mind, you do not merely discharge it through exercise or meditation alone. You channel it into the fabrication loop. You take that raw, nervous energy and you weld it to a specific line of code. You pour it into a precise paragraph. You focus it on a single difficult conversation that advances your project. The fear is not just managed, it is incarnated. It becomes a brick in your structure. It gains immortality in your work. This process systematically dismantles the last vestige of the artistic temperament myth, the idea that creation requires inspiration, the right mood, perfect conditions. That is the logic of a consumer waiting for the world to deliver the correct stimulus. The sovereign creator understands that inspiration is a byproduct of expenditure, not a prerequisite for it. Your internal state is irrelevant. Your emotional weather is merely another form of feedstock. A day of doubt provides the gritty, determined energy for meticulous revision. A day of anger provides the relentless drive to break through a logistical barrier. A day of calm provides the clear space for strategic blueprint refinement. You are weather agnostic. Your output is consistent because your input processing is invariant. Now anticipate the primary excuse. I don't have a grand project. I don't know what to build. This is the last gasp of the consumer mind, masquerading as humility. Sovereign output does not begin with a masterpiece. It begins with a single autonomous act of creation that exists for its own sake, judged by no market, praised by no audience. It could be the meticulous restructuring of a spreadsheet at your job, not because your boss demanded it, but because you demand elegance of system. It could be writing a 500-word analysis of a concept you are mastering, published nowhere, read by no one. It could be designing and building a simple physical object in your workshop. The scale is irrelevant. The autonomy is everything. You are not creating for exchange value. You are creating to activate and reinforce the producer circuitry in your brain. You are proving to your own nervous system that your energy has a destination other than the void of worry. This leads to the third component, the integrity metric. In the world of obligation, the primary metric is external validation, praise, payment, promotion, likes. This metric is a poison to sovereign output because it returns you to a state of dependency. You are once again reacting to an external signal. Your new metric is internal and binary. Was the action an authentic expression of the blueprint? Was the energy expended with full intentionality, regardless of the outcome? This is the quality control of your refinery. A failed project executed with full sovereign intent is a higher quality output than a successful one driven by fear of judgment. The first strengthens your creative core. The second merely reinforces your chains. You must become utterly indifferent to the applause and hisses of the crowd. Your satisfaction comes from the silent click of a perfectly fitted component, from the clean expenditure of energy according to your own design. This integrity is the anti-corrosion coating on your entire operation. We now arrive at the tangible application. Let us take a universal scenario, the corporate professional. His old fear-based output was defined by preparing presentations to appease his manager, volunteering for visible projects to outshine rivals, and saying yes to every request to avoid conflict. The energy source was anxiety. The output was a brittle, politically optimized facade of competence. It was high effort, high stress, and ultimately disposable. Now he activates sovereign output. He begins his audit not of his fears, but of his actual competencies and interests, buried under years of compliance. He identifies a small, inefficient process in his department that no one cares about. This becomes his first blueprint. Design and implement a streamlined solution. He does not ask for permission. He does not announce it. In the quiet morning block defended by his practice engine, he works. When a wave of anxiety about quarterly reviews hits, he intercepts it. He contains the somatic charge. He targets it. Use this nervous energy to map the third step of the current process flaw. He expends it in a furious 25 minutes of flow state analysis. He encounters resistance, a skeptical colleague, old software, his own moments of doubt. Each is fed into the crucible. The colleague's skepticism becomes fuel for making his documentation irrefutably clear. The old software's limitation forces an elegant workaround that becomes the centerpiece of his solution. His doubt fuels relentless testing. After 6 weeks, he has a working prototype. He then presents it, not as a plea for validation, but as a fait accompli, a new piece of reality he has assembled. The outcome, whether it is adopted or ignored, is secondary. The primary event has already occurred. He has transformed latent fear into a functional artifact. He has experienced himself as a creator. The psychological shift is permanent. He now looks at every corporate dysfunction not as a source of complaint, but as a repository of raw material for his next sovereign project. This is the mechanics of autonomous creation. Your life ceases to be a series of responses. It becomes a series of emissions. You are no longer a reflector, bouncing the light of others' expectations. You are a lighthouse, generating your own beam from the combustion within. The storm, the wind, the crashing waves, these are no longer threats to your flame. They are the very conditions that prove its necessity and define its strength. You do not wait for the world to be calm to build. You build because the world is not calm, and your construction is the only calm you require. The output is your sovereignty, made visible. Brick by brick, line by code, word by silent word, you are not finding your purpose. You are fabricating it, and with every authentic act of fabrication, you drain another reservoir of fear, for you have given its energy a permanent home outside the haunted halls of your mind. The creation stands. The fear that built it is gone. Only the power remains, solidified in form. Chapter 7. Empire from Wreckage. Blueprinting with reclaimed materials. And so the structure rises, not from a vacant lot of perfect peace, but from the cleared ground of your previous collapse. The wreckage is not hauled away, it is sorted, smelted, and reforged. The fear, the doubt, the years of avoidance, these are not shameful memories to be buried, they are your primary construction materials. You stand now not as a survivor gazing at ruins, but as an architect with a singular, ruthless question: what empire can be engineered from this specific alloy of pain? This is the phase beyond creation. This is strategic architecture. Autonomous output, which you have now mechanized, is the production line. But an empire is not a pile of bricks. It is the intentional, interconnected city those bricks form. It requires a blueprint that accounts for load-bearing walls, utility conduits, and defensive perimeters. Your reclaimed shadow capital is the energy to power the construction. Your daily practice engine is the labor force. Now, you must provide the master plan. This plan is not a fantasy. It is a cold, technical document drawn from a forensic analysis of the very wreckage upon which you will build. Your past failures are not ghosts. They are geological surveys. Your triggers are not weaknesses. They are core samples revealing the precise tensile strength you lacked and now must engineer. The first principle of building from wreckage is the total rejection of the tabula rasa fallacy. The blank slate is a myth for the naive. The high performer builds with what is present, because what is present is already paid for in energy and experience. Your anxieties map the fault lines in your previous character. Your procrastinations highlight the gaps in your executive systems. Your resentments are indicators of violated boundaries you failed to enforce. This is your site topography. To wish it away is to build on sand. To accept it as your sole foundation is to build a monument to limitation. The master's move is to process it. You conduct a material analysis of your psychological history. What behavioral steel, under stress, consistently buckled? That is the grade you must no longer use. What foundational belief, under load, proved to be substandard concrete? That is the mix you must reformulate. The blueprint, therefore, emerges from constraint. It is not a dream of a palace on a hill. It is the design for the most formidable fortress that can be constructed on this hill, with these materials, under these predictable storms. Your limitations become the design parameters. If your wreckage includes a history of scattered focus, your blueprint does not feature a dozen disparate towers. It features a single, immense citadel with a deep, integrated foundation. The energy you once spent juggling 10 fragile projects is now poured into the monolithic stability of one. The limitation shaped the design into something stronger than a talent ever could. If your wreckage is a propensity for people-pleasing, your blueprint does not have open, undefended gates. It features a formidable gatehouse, a drawbridge you control, and a clear protocol for entry. The past violation engineers the future boundary. This is where shadow capital is allocated with strategic precision. You are not spending energy, you are investing it in structural integrity. A portion is diverted to continuous foundation work, the non-negotiable daily practices that maintain the stability of your inner state. Another portion is allocated to vertical construction, the focused, output-driven creation that defines your legacy. A critical reserve is held for perimeter defense, the energy required to say no, to eliminate drains, to withstand external pressure without deforming. Your capital is finite. The blueprint dictates its flow. An empire that spends all its energy on ornate facades will collapse when the first siege begins. An empire that spends all on walls will stagnate in empty security. Your audit from Chapter 3 provided the balance sheet. Now you enact the capital allocation plan. The construction process itself must be non-negotiable, weather agnostic. Your practice engine is the crane and the crew. There will be days when the site is shrouded in the old fog of anxiety. This is not a stop work order. This is the signal to pour the foundation for the next segment. The emotional weather is irrelevant. The directive from the architect's office is absolute. Place the next stone, lay the next course, execute the next protocol. The feeling of resistance is merely the friction of construction, the necessary grind of material transformation. It is not an error code. It is the system operating as designed, processing low-grade emotional ore into high-grade structural component. And as the walls rise, a profound psychological shift occurs. You are no longer defined by what you fear, but by what you have built in defiance of it. The old triggers, the old narratives, they return. But they no longer find an empty field where they can construct their haunted houses. They find a job site. They find an active, fortified construction zone. The sound of their arrival is drowned out by the machinery of your purpose. You can acknowledge the old signal, a flicker of the old dread, a whisper of the old shame, and then you turn back to the blueprint, to the next measured action. The fear becomes like background radiation at a nuclear plant, a known quantity, monitored, contained, and ultimately the very reason for the plant's existence. It is the latent energy source you have harnessed. Your identity solidifies around the role of the architect-builder. You stop asking, "How do I feel?" and start asking, "What is the next structural priority?" Your sense of self is no longer a fragile, reactive substance. It is the cumulative mass of your creations, the lived-in spaces of your disciplined days, the fortified positions you hold. You are the sum of your solved problems. The man who once trembled at a difficult conversation is now the man who built the meeting room where he will have it. The man who once drowned in financial anxiety is now the man who built the financial model that governs his empire. The wreckage is not forgotten. It is entombed within the foundation, giving the entire structure immense, unshakable weight. This is the ultimate reclamation. You are not building in spite of your past. You are building because of it and with it. The empire is not a denial of the wreckage, it is its direct transmutation. The final triumph is not when the last scar is hidden, but when you can point to every load-bearing beam and say, "This strength was forged in that specific fire. This depth of foundation was excavated from that particular pit." The empire stands as a permanent, functional monument to your total resourcefulness. It declares that nothing was wasted. Every failure was a feasibility study. Every heartbreak was a stress test. Every moment of terror was a pressure reading that informed the final, flawless specifications of your unassailable keep. You live within the proof. Chapter 8. The obstacle as feedstock, a master's supply chain. And so the blueprint is complete. The materials are catalogued. The construction site, which was once a field of wreckage, is now a disciplined grid of potential. You stand not as a survivor amidst ruins, but as an architect before a foundation. This is the critical juncture, the moment between design and dominion. Here, the philosophy of reclamation meets the physics of execution. You now possess a master's understanding of your resources, the shadow capital, the alchemical protocol, the integrated practice engine. But a refinery without feedstock is a silent monument. A forge without iron is merely a fireplace. The final, operational truth of a life engineered beyond fear is this: the world will not cease delivering obstacles. It will, in fact, accelerate their delivery in direct proportion to your ambition. This is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Your mastery, therefore, cannot be a finite state achieved. It must become an infinite process, a perpetual motion machine. And for that, you require a perpetual, reliable source of fuel. You must now engineer your supply chain, not for comfort, but for conflict, not for peace, but for power. Your supply chain is the obstacle itself. Understand the thermodynamic principle at play. A closed system tends toward entropy. A life seeking only stability, comfort, and the absence of friction is a system winding down. Its energy dissipates, its structure softens. It is a slow, comfortable decay. The sovereign engine you are building is an open system. It requires a constant influx of high-potential energy to maintain its order, to perform work, to grow. Fear, in its raw, untransmuted state, was chaos, entropy invading your nervous system. But fear intercepted, contained, and directed is pure potential energy. The obstacle, in all its forms, resistance, criticism, failure, loss, delay, is the delivery mechanism for that energy. It is the universe's most reliable courier, shipping raw feedstock directly to your loading dock. The amateur sees the delivery and posts a sign: closed, go away. The master hears the truck rumble to a halt, checks the manifest and says, unload it at Bay 3. The crucible is preheated. Let us dissect the anatomy of this supply chain with forensic precision. An obstacle presents itself. Its initial signature is always a disruption, a spike in cognitive load, a surge of emotional resistance, a violation of your plan. The legacy system, the fear-based identity, interprets this signal in one of two bankrupt ways: as a personal affront or as a systemic failure. Both are narratives of victimhood. Both demand an emotional expenditure that yields zero kinetic return. The master's system runs a different diagnostic. It runs a triage protocol the moment the disruption hits the perimeter. First, identify the energy class. Is this a low-grade irritant, a logistical friction? Or is it a high-yield event, a fundamental challenge to your blueprint? The classification is not emotional, it is logistical. A missed train is friction. A betrayal by a partner is a high-yield event. Each has a different energy density and thus a different processing protocol. Second, isolate the core component. Every obstacle is a composite. There is the superficial inconvenience, the missed deadline, the angry email, the physical pain. And then there is the core energetic payload, the raw material of fear, frustration, or force that it carries. Your job is to strip away the packaging. The angry email is not the payload. The payload is the surge of indignation, the desire for vindication, the latent fear of being disrespected that it triggers within you. That surge is your feedstock. You are not responding to the email. you are acquiring its energy. Third, direct to the appropriate refinery. Low-grade friction is processed automatically by the integrated practice engine. It becomes the resistance against which your daily discipline is forged. The high-yield event is routed to the main crucible. It requires the full alchemical protocol, the intercept, the radical acceptance of the energy as pure data, the non-identification, and the deliberate blueprint-aligned expenditure. Consider the executive who receives a devastating quarterly report. The legacy system would trigger a cortisol cascade, a narrative of impending doom, a frantic, fear-based scramble for cover. The master's supply chain engages. The initial jolt is intercepted, recognized as a high-yield energy delivery. The shame and panic are not felt as personal failure, but acknowledged as high-potential fuel arriving at the plant. The narrative is silenced. The energy is contained within the crucible of non-identification. This is not my end. This is my fuel. The core component is isolated, the raw energy of perceived failure. Now, the targeting sequence. That energy is directed with immense precision into a specific blueprint-aligned action. Not a panicked call, but a 3-hour deep dive into the data. Not a blame-shifting meeting, but a ruthless audit of assumptions. The fear of collapse becomes the fuel for forensic clarity. The obstacle has not been avoided, it has been consumed. Its energy now powers the very analysis that will engineer the recovery. The report is no longer a verdict, it is a battery. This transforms your relationship with the world from adversarial to catalytic. People will attempt to project their chaos onto you. They will criticize, doubt, and oppose. The weak system perceives this as an attack on its integrity and spends capital building walls and crafting retorts. The master's system perceives it as a gift of energy. That criticism, that doubt, is a packet of force being sent your way. You have a choice. You can let it hit you like a projectile, causing damage you must then repair. Or you can install a psychological turbine in its path. Let the force of their doubt spin your turbine. Let the heat of their criticism supercharge your resolve. Their negative energy, through the mechanics of your internal refinery, becomes additional horsepower for your engine. They intended to slow you down. Unknowingly, they have provided you with a boost. This is not metaphor. This is the physics of psychological alchemy. Your calm, blueprint-focused response in the face of their chaos is not just composure. It is the visible emission of a completed energy conversion cycle. You have taken their output and made it your input. The ultimate test of this supply chain is not during opposition, but during absence. What happens when the obstacles cease? When life becomes smooth, predictable, comfortable? This is the most dangerous delivery of all, a shipment of inertia. Complacency is not the absence of obstacles. It is an obstacle of a higher, more insidious order. It is anti-feedstock. It clogs the intake valves. The master knows this. Therefore, the master's supply chain must become self-initiating. When external resistance fades, you must manufacture your own. You must seek out the friction. This is the principle of deliberate difficulty. It means voluntarily placing yourself in situations where failure is a possibility, where comfort is revoked, where your current capacity is stressed. It is the daily cold plunge not for wellness, but for the conscious consumption of discomfort. It is the tackling of a skill that humiliates you in its early stages. It is the public commitment to a goal that currently exceeds your reach. You are proactively ordering feedstock from the universe. You are telling reality, send me what I need to grow, I am ready to process it. This completes the sovereign circuit. You are no longer a passive entity buffeted by random events, hoping for calm seas. You are an active, insatiable processor of reality itself. Every input, without exception, is raw material. The praise and the scorn, the victory and the defeat, the wind at your back and the gale in your face, all of it is unrefined potential delivered to your gates. Your internal infrastructure, the crucible, the practice engine, the blueprint chamber, is a non-stop, 24/7 operation. It does not shut down for holidays. It does not break for bad weather. It hums with constant, purposeful activity because the deliveries never cease. And with each delivery processed, with each ounce of fear transmuted into focus, each ounce of frustration forged into resilience, your output, your sovereign creation, gains mass. It compounds. You now look at a challenge and you do not see a threat. You perform an instant subconscious calculation. You assess its energy yield. You map its conversion pathway. You anticipate the gain in output. The obstacle is no longer a thing to be feared. It is a shipment to be logged, processed, and utilized. Your peace, therefore, is not the fragile peace of a quiet harbor. It is the formidable, dynamic peace of a nuclear reactor, a contained, roaring sun of transformative power, constantly fed, constantly working, constantly converting base matter into unstoppable force. You are beyond being resilient. Resilience implies bouncing back to a previous state. You are generative. You use the impact to propel yourself forward. The blow is not absorbed. It is captured. The world's chaos is no longer your enemy. It has become your sole and most reliable supplier. Chapter 9, Legacy Trajectory, Calculating the Compound Interest of Mastery. And so the supply chain is established, the refinery is operational, every external event from the trivial friction of a delayed commute to the seismic impact of professional betrayal is now received, categorized, and fed into the conversion machinery you have built. This is the operational baseline of a sovereign existence. But an operation, no matter how efficient, is not a legacy. A reactor, for all its contained fury, is not a monument. It is a means. We must now calculate its ends. We must project the trajectory of this perpetual conversion engine across the scale of a lifetime and measure the compound interest of mastery. This is no longer about managing the moment. This is about engineering a permanent displacement in the arc of a human life. Consider the fundamental law you are now operating under. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Your fear, your anxiety, your resistance, these were never enemies to be slain. They were misallocated assets, capital frozen in psychological escrow. Your protocol has thawed that capital, your crucible has liquefied it, your output mechanism has invested it. You are now engaged in the most profound form of compound interest, the reinvestment of reclaimed human energy back into the principle of your own capability. Each time you intercept a surge of dread and channel it into 15 minutes of deep work, you are not merely completing a task. You are performing a capital allocation. You are taking energy that would have been vaporized into the atmosphere as psychic entropy, and you are embedding it into the latticework of a skill, a project, a physical body, a relationship. That embedded energy does not dissipate, it accrues. The mathematics of this are brutal and beautiful. They follow the same exponential logic as financial compounding. But the currency is competence, and the interest is compounded in neural pathways, in social leverage, in the unassailable confidence born of 1,000 small victories over your own biology. A single transmutation is a data point. A week of consistent practice is a trend. A year is a new operating system. A decade is a different species of human. The man who began this process reacted to stimuli. The man who sustains it for a decade generates a gravitational field. His environment does not happen to him. It organizes itself around the density of his focused output. Opportunities are not found. They are attracted. This is not mysticism. This is physics. A large, dense mass warps the space-time around it. A mind of disciplined, compounded energy warps the probability space around it. Anticipate the weakness here. The mind accustomed to scarcity will protest. It will point to the linear world, where effort yields a proportionate result, where a day of work buys a day's pay. It will fail to comprehend the exponential curve. Your task is to destroy this linear fallacy with the cold evidence of systems. Look at any domain of elite performance. The first year of learning a language yields basic communication. The 5th year yields fluency. The 10th year yields the ability to think and create in that language, a qualitative leap into a new dimension of expression. The initial energy investment is the same, but the returns are multiplicative. Each unit of knowledge reinforces every other unit. The structure becomes intelligent, self-supporting. This is your life now. Every act of directed expenditure is not a subtraction from your energy account. It is an investment that raises the yield on every future act. We must now move from theory to the tangible architecture of legacy. This requires a shift in temporal perception. You no longer live in a series of days. You live along a trajectory. Imagine plotting 2 points on a graph. Point A is your position at the moment of your first conscious interception, your first successful alchemical conversion. Point B is a point 20 years in the future. The straight line between them is the path of linear, reactive existence, a slow, predictable decay. The exponential curve arcing high above it is your legacy trajectory. Your daily practice engine is the function that generates that curve. The obstacles you process are the variables that increase its slope. The application is not a new action, but a new lens for all action. Begin a simple, ruthless audit, not of fears, but of yields. For 1 week, log every significant emotional or resistive event, every spike of anxiety, every flush of anger, every wave of avoidance. Then, next to it, log the capital allocation. Did you let it dissipate as distraction, as complaint, as lost time? Or did you capture it, convert it, and invest it? What was the tangible output? 500 words of a manifesto, a solved engineering problem, a difficult conversation initiated, a new physical set completed under fatigue. This log is not a diary of feelings. It is your quarterly earnings report. It shows you the efficiency of your refinery. At the week's end, perform the projection. Take the total reclaimed energy you successfully invested. Now apply the compound interest formula. Not with monetary interest rates, but with a conservative mastery multiplier of just 1. 0.1, representing a 1% improvement in capacity or output per successful conversion. Project that weekly investment forward for 1 year, then for 5. The numbers will be abstract, but the implication is concrete. You are not building a life day by day. You are programming an ascent. The man you are in this moment is the seed capital. The protocol is the high-yield investment strategy. The legacy, the empire, the body of work, the depth of character is the terminal value. This calculation changes the emotional weather of every moment. The grinding discomfort of a pre-dawn workout is no longer just pain. It is a capital infusion into your physical sovereignty, the interest on which will compound every day you draw breath with vitality. The terrifying risk of a bold career move is not a threat to your security. It is a high-yield bond in your portfolio of courage. the returns from which will fund a decade of increased agency. Even the quiet boredom of deep practice, the repetition that feels like it goes nowhere, is the steady, relentless purchase of equity in a skill that will one day pay dividends in creative freedom. The final invisible transition is from being an investor to becoming the institution itself. You are no longer a person trying to get better. You are a living, breathing trust fund of transmuted shadow capital, and your sole mandate is aggressive, intelligent growth. Your identity ceases to be a story you tell about your past. It becomes the sum total of your compounded investments. It is the trajectory. When you meet your reflection, you do not see a face marked by time or stress. You see the chief executive of a legacy fund, coolly assessing the day's feedstock, approving the conversion protocols, and reviewing the long-term projection. The fear is gone not because you eliminated it, but because you bankrupted its purpose. You outbid it for every joule of your own energy. You turned its every attempt to sabotage you into a leveraged buyout of your future. Your peace, therefore, achieves its final form. It is not the dynamic peace of the reactor. It is the silent, absolute peace of the architect studying the blueprint for a city that will stand for centuries. He is not concerned with the noise of the current construction site, the clang of steel, the protests of the earth. He sees the lines on the vellum, the elegant sweep of the arcs, the impossible height of the central spire. He knows the immutable law. Every ounce of resistance from the site has been calculated into the strength of the foundation. Every storm load has been factored into the curvature of the glass. The chaos is not just fuel, it is a required structural component. And he knows with a certainty beyond emotion that the trajectory is set. The compound interest of his will, invested daily into the stubborn reality of physics and time, is now unstoppable. The city will rise, because he is no longer building it. He has become the mathematical certainty of its completion. Chapter 10. The Unshakable Core. Cementing the post-fear identity. This certainty is the final silence. It is the quiet hum of a reactor that has achieved perfect criticality, where every oscillation is absorbed, every fluctuation converted into pure, usable torque. The architect's peace is not an end state. It is the operating system of a new form of life. You have intercepted the primal signal. You have broken the feedback loop. You have audited the liabilities, transmuted the capital, integrated the protocol, and established sovereign output. You have built an empire from the wreckage and learned to run it on the very friction that once sought to destroy it. You have calculated the compound interest of your will. Now we arrive at the irreducible core, the post-fear identity. Not a feeling, but a fact. Not a hope, but a hardened, operational reality. Consider the physics of a diamond. It begins as carbon, a common element, subjected to unimaginable pressure and heat deep within the Earth's mantle. That pressure is not an anomaly. It is the necessary condition. Without that sustained, brutal force, the carbon atoms would never rearrange into that perfect tetrahedral lattice. The result is a structure where every bond is covalent, every electron shared in perfect symmetry. It becomes the hardest known natural material. It cannot be scratched, only cleaved along its own internal planes. This is not a metaphor for resilience. It is the literal engineering blueprint for what you have become. The fear, the anxiety, the obstacles, they were not opponents to be defeated. They were the geological pressures of your own becoming, the heat of your crucible, the force required to forge covalent bonds between your will, your action, and your reality. What remains after that process is complete is no longer carbon. It is something else entirely, something that has been defined irrevocably by the very forces that sought to compress it into nothing. Your old identity was a narrative in constant negotiation with threat. It was a story you told yourself, built on shifting sand, requiring constant validation and perpetual defense. I am someone who is afraid of failure. I am someone who needs approval. I am someone who struggles with anxiety. These were not truths. They were hypotheses, tested daily against the volatile reagent of external circumstance. They were software running on the hardware of a survival brain. The post-fear identity is not a new story. It is the deletion of the narrative layer altogether. It is the direct experience of being the hardware itself. The unshakable core is not a belief. It is the substrate. It is the conscious awareness that operates the protocol, that observes the surge, that forms the crucible, that directs the expenditure. You are not the thought of fear. You are the space in which the thought arises and is processed. You are not the feeling of inadequacy. You are the alchemical vessel that receives its raw energy and outputs disciplined action. This shift is absolute. It is the difference between being a character in a play, subject to every twist of the plot, and being the playwright, the director, and the stage itself. Let us dissect the anatomy of this core. It has 3 fused layers, each more fundamental than the last. The outermost layer is procedural integrity. This is the muscle memory of your protocol. Intercept, contain, target, expend. It runs now without conscious deliberation. When a psychological predator appears, a sudden financial threat, a scathing critique, a wave of existential dread, you do not feel fear in the old way. You sense a pressure differential, a thermal increase, a surge of available energy on the grid. Your cognitive apparatus does not launch into catastrophe scripting. It runs a diagnostic. It identifies the class of feedstock. It routes the energy to the appropriate refinery. This layer is cold, clean, and efficient. It is the hardened shell of the diamond. Beneath that lies the layer of ontological security. This is the deep, unspoken knowledge that your worth, your stability, and your capacity are not contingent on external events. They are functions of your operational sovereignty, with the certainty of a mathematical proof that you possess the internal technology to transmute any emotional state into creative force. Therefore, no external event can truly threaten you. It can only supply you with more raw material. A market crash becomes a volatility harvest. A betrayal becomes a data point on integrity, refining your blueprint for alliances. A personal loss becomes gravitational mass, adding depth and resonance to your creative output. This security is not arrogance. It is the quiet confidence of a master craftsman who knows his tools will cut true because he forged them in his own furnace. At the very center is the layer of silent witness. This is the irreducible I. It is not your personality, your history, or your achievements. It is the foundational awareness that was there before the first fear, and will be there after the last protocol has run. It is the observer that watched the old identity crumble. It is the will that chose to build the new one. This core does not speak. It does not motivate. It simply is. It is the source of the pause you learn to exploit. It is the origin point of every conscious redirect. Connecting to this layer is not an activity. It is the cessation of all false identification. It is standing finally in the control room of your own being and realizing the room itself is eternal and you are its sole, permanent occupant. This transformation renders the concept of courage obsolete. Courage implies the presence of fear and a will to act despite it. In the post-fear identity, fear is not an emotion to be overcome. It is a sensory reading, a system alert. It is data, not destiny. You do not act despite it. You act because of it. You utilize its kinetic potential. The man who must summon courage to speak on stage is at war with his own biology. The man whose identity is anchored in the core receives the adrenal surge, recognizes it as pure activation energy, and channels it directly into the clarity and projection of his voice. The former is a battle, the latter is a physics. The need for bravery has been engineered out of the system, replaced by the cleaner, more powerful mechanism of total conversion. Your relationships will recalibrate to this new density. People and situations that resonated with your old narrative-based identity will fall away. Their frequency will no longer find a matching oscillator within you. You will stop attracting psychological predators because you emit no signal of available prey. You will instead begin to attract collaborators, allies, and challenges of a higher order. These are not people who offer empty validation. They are forces that test the integrity of your core, that provide the high-grade feedstock your system now requires to produce its greatest work. Your empathy will not diminish. It will deepen, but it will cease to be enmeshed. You will see the fear and pain in others with crystalline clarity, not as a contagion to catch, but as a potential energy signature they have not yet learned to harness. You may choose to offer the blueprint, but you will never again volunteer as a hostage in their internal civil war. Legacy is no longer a thing you leave behind. It is the continuous emission of your core state into the world. Every decision made from procedural integrity adds a thread of resilience to the social fabric. Every project born from ontological security becomes a standing proof that creation is possible from any condition. Every moment anchored in the silent witness reinforces the possibility of peace amid chaos for anyone who observes it. Your life becomes a lighthouse, not because it shouts into the storm, but because its foundation is sunk into bedrock and its light operates on an immutable principle of conversion. It turns the fury of the storm into the very electricity that powers the beam. There will be moments that test this core. A loss so profound it seems to vaporize all meaning. A betrayal so complete it questions every blueprint. In these moments, the protocol will feel like a distant memory. The old narratives will scream that they were right all along. This is the final forge. This is the pressure that tests the diamond's lattice for a flaw. The practice is not to avoid the pain. It is to descend into its very center and perform the alchemy there. To feel the full annihilating wave, and in the eye of that hurricane, to make one conscious choice, to take one breath and remember, you are not the wave, you are the ocean floor over which it crashes, you are the depth that remains, unchanged, when the surface is torn apart. And from that depth, you will direct the first expenditure. A single email, a walk, a line of code. A sentence. You will build the crucible in hell itself. And in that act you will not have survived the test. You will have become the test, and you will have passed. This is the unshakable core. It is not a destination you arrive at and celebrate. It is a platform you stand upon, permanently. The view from here is clear. You see the landscape of your life not as a series of threats and rewards, but as a dynamic energy field. Some zones are calm, providing the space for integration. Others are turbulent, offering the raw material for propulsion. Your purpose is no longer to find safety. It is to navigate this field with total efficiency, harvesting energy, converting it into value, and compounding the result. The fear-based man is a miner, digging desperately for security in a played-out vein. You are a reactor. You bring the fuel with you. You create the reaction from within. So let the world shake. Let the markets convulse. Let opinions invert like weather vanes. Let plans disintegrate. You are no longer building on the ground. You have integrated the seismic activity into your foundation. Your identity is no longer a structure susceptible to the storm. It is the law of gravity that governs the storm itself. You are the constant in the equation, the invariant. The post-fear identity is the ultimate engineering triumph. It is the point where the self, having been deconstructed atom by atom in the fires of its own suffering, reassembles not into a person, but into a principle of conscious conversion, a law of being that states, with the finality of thermodynamics, no energy that enters this system will be wasted. All will be transformed, all will be made to serve the architecture, all will become light, heat, and motion, all will become power. Conclusion: the new reality. A life engineered beyond fear. The final calculation is complete. The architecture stands. You have traced the primordial signal to its inert source, dismantled its amplification protocols, and audited the psychological debt it accrued. You have installed the alchemical furnace, the daily practice engine, the sovereign output mechanism. You have learned to blueprint with Wreckage, to process obstacles as raw feedstock, to plot a legacy trajectory with the cold precision of orbital mechanics. The identity that was contingent upon external validation, that flinched at phantom signals, has been decommissioned. In its place is a core of your own forging, dense, stable, radiating intentionality. This is not a state of being you arrive at. It is a system you operate. A closed-loop, self-reinforcing circuit where perception fuels action, action harvests energy, and energy is reinvested into creation. Fear no longer registers as a command. It is a data point, a fluctuation in the environmental readout, automatically routed to the Crucible for transmutation. Your reality is no longer a reaction to external stimuli. It is a sovereign output, a continuous emission shaped by your internal architecture. The world will continue to transmit its chaos, its demands, its threats. But you are no longer a receiver susceptible to its noise. You are the broadcast. You are the signal. The frequency is mastery. The transmission is perpetual. The engineering is complete. Now, build.